Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today, as you know, we're looking at Porphyria's lover. I'll explain soon why I've divided it into stanzas for you. And let me give you a heads up on what you're going to learn in this video. First, I'm going to outline the plot. There's a couple of things you need to know for it to make sense. Then I'm going to take you through the Foss way, my method of getting you the top grades when you write about the poem. So you write about the form, the opening, the language features, the structure and the ending in that order. That's going to be enough to get you in the top grades. Then I'm going to give you specific grade 8 and 9 stuff by looking at different interpretations. We'll take a feminist interpretation, a Marxist one, a Christian one. I'll link it to the literary context. Then we'll have the psychoanalytic one, and then a bonus feature, an extra interpretation of the ending. Now, these interpretations you will be able to learn from to apply to any text that you study. So I'm hoping you'll get a double whammy of brilliant revision from this revision video. And then I never know whether students want the poem read out or not, but I will also read it at the final part of the video. So this is the shocking story of a man who kills his lover because he realizes that at this moment she loves him, but that in the future she will leave him. She'll leave him because he is her social inferior. So it's a poem about class, and their love is therefore hidden because she keeps it hidden, and it won't be accepted by society because he is socially inferior to her. He kills her, he imagines, gently. He describes it as a gentle affair. He uses her long hair as his murder weapon, and he wraps it sensuously around her neck 3 times, each turn a little tighter. It is a kind of foreplay, which is why she allows it to happen, and she dies with her eyes shut, as though imagining what's going to happen next. Little does she know, it's her own death. However, his desire isn't really sexual. Instead, he sits her dead body next to him, placing her head on his shoulder as he sits alone with his thoughts until he finally speaks them to us, directly to us, as a kind of confession. His confession is full of passion, humour, anger and deceit. He deceives himself a lot in it. In the final line, he appears to challenge God to punish him, either in defiance or welcome. So either he welcomes that punishment or he doesn't believe God's going to punish him at all. And we can't be sure. It's quite unsettling. Right, the first part of the Foss way is form. And when you start writing about form, you're automatically at grade 7 and above. And that's why I suggest you write about form first so you don't forget. Well, there are 3 obvious features of the form which we're going to look at. Number 1, this is written as a dramatic monologue, which means we only get one side of the story from the speaker. It's also written in one large stanza, and I've broken it up for you to show you the rhyme scheme and also discuss why Browning didn't publish it logically in each stanza, why he's just had it as one. Purpose of the monologue is that it asks us as readers to really fathom the motives of the speaker. And that's the main challenge of the poem. So it's a really great way to challenge the reader and get us really involved with this character and therefore the poet's message. So that's technique number 1 with the form. Technique number 2 is this quite tight rhyme scheme where the speaker keeps ending these stanzas, although remember it isn't presented as stanzas like this, it's just one stanza, but keeps presenting them as rhyming couplets. Now this is a symbol of how he wants to become a couple. He wants his lover to be his forever, but he realises he can't have her. So that's why he keeps trying to end with a couplet, but why that doesn't succeed as ending the stanza. Because if it did, that would be a kind of fitting end, and that doesn't fit the poem. There is no fitting end here. He's actually going to murder his lover, hardly a fitting end. Another reason why Browning presents it as just one large stanza is to try and show that this lover is losing control. He thinks that what he's doing is rational, but actually it is far from it. And so the form deviates from the form that you'd expect the poem to be in to a much more clumsy one. Okay, well, let's see what some of that looks like in writing. What I'm giving you here is an extract from my literature guide so that you can see what it might look like in an essay. So although it tries to mimic natural speech, it's written in iambic pentameter, it's written with a strict rhyming pattern, as we've seen. The rhyming couplets are perhaps an echo of his desire to remain a couple. You might describe the asymmetrical pattern as reflecting the irrationality of the speaker. So, for example, if this were going to be symmetrical, it would be A, B, A, B, A. I've set the poem out above in its logical rational form so that each stanza clearly reflects this pattern. But in your anthology, just the way Browning published it, there are no stanzas. And this is Browning's deliberate choice to unsettle his readers. He has changed the expected form, the one I've given you, to the compressed version. It's a clear signal that his speaker has the wrong form. It hints at his madness and proves his lack of clear thinking. It's another dramatic monologue and another dramatic confession. Unlike the Duke in My Last Duchess, who feels he can get away with murder, there is the possibility that the last line hints at the speaker's desire for punishment. Alternatively, could be an attack on Christian morality, because if there is no God to punish him, why should he fear acting out on any of his desires, and therefore why should we? So that's your grade 7 in the bag already. Now we're going to look at the opening of the poem and link it to Romanticism. The rain set early into night, the sullen wind was soon awake, it tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. And so we've got this heightened emotion which is typical of the Romantic poets. We also have pathetic fallacy, where the weather gives us the emotion of the character, who is indeed sullen and very possibly full of spite. And he's certainly going to do his best to vex his lover when she comes in. And she enters in a complete contrast to him. Look at the verb glided here. She comes in without a care in the world, a complete contrast to the weather, and therefore a complete contrast to his misery. So the subject matter is typical of Romantic poetry. It's two lovers, they're out in the countryside. The stormy weather, the nighttime setting, the cosy isolated cottage, the image of rural perfection are all present at the beginning. But this is done ironically. The weather echoes that of the storm which brought Frankenstein's monster to life. I do an analysis in the literature guide which is kind of beyond grade 9. I'm not going to take you through that now. Browning makes sure that he describes Porphyria as completely opposite to her lover. So she comes in and shuts the cold out. So by implication she's therefore warm, and she shuts the storm out, therefore trying to shut out his bad mood. She kneels, so she makes herself subservient to him, and made the cheerless great. In other words, she starts lighting the fire, which is cheerless in reflection of him. So another example of pathetic fallacy. Then it blazes up, and all the cottage is warm, which done, she rose. So she brings warmth with her, and he's going to reject that and kill her. Okay, my next task is to write about language features, which I have with this acronym SOAP-AIMS. Simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, adverbs, imagery, metaphor, and the senses. Now, I'm just using that just to remind you it's language features. You don't have to use any of those, and they're often far better ones. Okay, so Browning departs dramatically from those kinds of romantic scenes by exploring her sexuality. So he focuses on her soiled gloves, and this word soiled makes it symbolic of her and the way she has gone against the social ideas of purity by taking a lover. So we don't know if she's married and this is her lover, or if she's single and this is her lover. But either way, she's defying the conventions of society, which said she had to remain a virgin until marriage, and having an affair for her own pleasure. So rather than being delighted that she's having an affair, because this is a patriarchal society, he still judges her and sees her as soiled. So she also, shockingly for Victorian times, takes the lead. So she starts directing her lover's arm about her waist, doesn't wait for him, but encourages this physical contact. Then she partly undresses, is Victorian times, so nothing too naked, and made her smooth white shoulder bare. So she's starting to expose her shoulders and inviting him to imagine what more is beneath. When he fails to respond, she places his cheek on her shoulder. So sensual, but also dominant, usurping his power as a male. And then she more sensually covers him with her blonde damp hair. So she puts that actually over his head. He imagines the sexual pleasures they will enjoy, comparing it to tonight's gay feast. But unfortunately, tonight's gay feast is where she's just been without him. So this is a metaphor for sexual appetite, but also for her appetite not fully involving him, because he's been excluded from tonight's gay feast. And then he drops a really clear clue as to why this lover has been excluded. So what stops her seeing him as a potential husband appears to be society, which we get from the line pride and vainer ties, which suggests her reputation would be damaged if it were public knowledge that she was linked to him. So he suspects she will finally reject him, realizing his love of her is all in vain. Yep, so here he sees her as too weak to set her heart's passion free from pride. So it's pride that's holding her back from telling the world that she loves him, and it's vanity because it's linked to her sense of self, and she's not going to give herself to this lover because the implication is he's not from her class. And that's emphasised with another contrast where she's come from tonight's gay feast. And the word feast really invites us to imagine a huge number of guests, and that's contrasted to him who was all on his own, pale, waiting for her. And the word pale there in comparison hints at the poverty of his social status. Okay, in your writing you also have to write about the structure. It's not just form, but form and structure. Now I've covered most of this in the video, but let's see what it looks like in writing. As you can see in my rendering of the poem, it's written in stanzas of 5 lines. However, it's not published that way, as you know. This jars the reader, finding it in one single stanza. The structure is deliberately unsettling, just as the speaker is. Similarly, the rhyme scheme of AB, ABB is unbalanced, as we talked about before, being asymmetrical, just as Porphyria's lover is unbalanced in his motives. We might add that the constant return to a rhyming couplet reflects his attempt to hold on to Porphyria's love for him forever, believing that he can do so even in death. Because you remember, he sits her up on the couch next to him, just sitting next to him, as though he can preserve that moment forever. Right, we now need to consider the ending, and that's important whatever text you're studying, because this is where the writer gives their final change of perspective or change of ideas. And as you know, writing about the writer's perspectives gets you the top grades. So, however, he does not kill her out of jealousy that another, richer man will marry her, nor does he do it out of anger because she will leave him. Instead, he kills her because for the first time he realises she loves him. At last I knew. Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell. The shock of this discovery makes him react to preserve that love forever in a way he knows is impossible in real life. So the Romantic poets, as you know, risked everything for love. Well, maybe you don't know that. There's a big section on the Romantic poets in my guide. I'm going to give you a little bit of biographical detail about Browning. So, like Shelley, a poet that he admired tremendously, he went against his father's wishes in order to marry. They risked everything for love, these poets. And again, like Shelley, he eloped to Italy. Eloped means they got married without parental permission and went to live in Pisa and Florence. And although he continued to publish poetry, he was better known as Elizabeth's husband. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? The man playing second fiddle to the woman, which is unusual in Victorian society, but you can see this theme reflected in the poem. The male lover is subservient to the female lover from a higher social status, and Browning's own wife had a higher social status within his literary world. She was a better known poet. However, she died in 1861 and Robert and their son returned to London. So it's quite an interesting coincidence, perhaps, that he then wrote these monologues in a book called Dramatis Personae, which he published in 1964. So this is the kind of poem that's only published in this form once his wife is dead. So there is a nice level of irony there that he only becomes famous once his wife is no longer the famous living poet. So anyway, the Romantics spurned society's rules and lived on their own terms. And you can see that in the subject matter. This isn't the normal subject matter of a love poem, is it? It's quite the reverse of that. In this reading, Browning is the lover refusing to conform. Here he punishes his lover for conforming, for not living and loving as her true self. So he kills her because she has given in to society's rules instead of following her heart and following her lover. Ironically, however, he punishes her by murdering her just as society would punish her. Her crime is social transgression, going against society's rules, a great word to steal. First, in having sex outside of marriage, and secondly, in choosing a social inferior as a lover. But finally, and most importantly, loving someone who is socially inferior. So Browning could be making a wider symbolic point here that when we meet this lover who seems mad, actually this lover is only doing what society does to people of different classes. It forbids them from coming together. It kills their love. Okay, now I'm going to give you some grade 7, 8 and 9 context. Porphyria's Lover was first published under the title Madhouse Cells. Now, the logic of this suggests that social prejudice has led to the lover's madness. Okay, so that was the first way that Browning interpreted his own poem. Society prevents people from following their love and passions, and therefore those passions are dangerously transformed. In other words, the poet Browning is blaming society for producing this madness in the lover because he's not allowed to love the woman who he loves and she's not allowed to love him. Therefore, his solution is to try and preserve her love forever, or at least for one night, and he focuses on her smiling blue eyes, which laughed. Again, heavy irony there because it doesn't sound plausible. He's just killed her. The final couplet, and yet God has not said a word, can be interpreted in a number of ways. God has not said a word because God is a social construct. In other words, he could be saying that God isn't real. Christianity is just something invented by the church in order to keep people in line. And it has no power because he does not exist. If this is the speaker's point, it also suggests that a belief in God will benefit society because the murder might never have taken place if the lover believed God's power was real. So this could be Browning arguing that actually Christianity is a benefit to society. It stops people behaving in this evil and irrational way. But alternatively, and that word means we can take the interpretation in a totally different direction, this is an attack on a very real God who has stopped seeking to help mankind. So he's accusing God of not saying a word. We might read into this the Victorian obsession with crime in their society and the idea that it is growing out of control. So if you're lucky enough to be studying Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this will be familiar to you. Or it might simply reveal the madness of the speaker to a Christian audience. And remember, nearly all the readers would have been Christian, who believe that eternal damnation in hell is far worse than any punishment he might receive now by the law if he gets caught. If he is not caught, then that freedom is illusory. So God's going to punish him for eternity, and this therefore just shows his madness again to a Victorian Christian reader. Alternatively, it's an attack on the status quo and the patriarchal society, which allows a man to believe he can get away with murder simply because the victim is a woman. So this is a patriarchal reading that says only a man could imagine this in this society where everything in society is geared up towards male power and male advantage. Patriarchal power is so deranged that the killer can even imagine that his lover welcomed her death. His madness is therefore not an individual thing, it is a representation of the views of men that women are only an extension of themselves and that everything about them, even their lives, are simply men's possessions. Okay, so to simplify that, she's treated this way because that's how society views women, as just an extension of men and possessed by men. So although the act of killing her seems like an act of madness, Browning could be arguing, actually that's just a small step from the madness of a society that treats women as inferior. And we can go back to those biographical details and talk about his love for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was a much more successful poet than him, and that he does that out of joy. He fully respects her as an equal, not as an inferior woman who's his possession, and indeed you could argue that fleeing Britain as they did shows how he wanted to escape those confining social values that are in Britain and move to another country where it would be more natural to treat a woman as an equal to a man. Right, well that's now given you a grade 7 understanding of the poem at least. We're now diving into grade 8 and 9 with these interpretations. So it makes sense now to look at the feminist perspective because we've already seen how he seems to be in favour of women having an equal status to men. Porphyria is the victim of a patriarchal society. Her lover demands to see her as a possession and kills her in order to possess her. The ending points out how absurd this patriarchal ambition is. The man who owns her actually has nothing. She's dead. All he owns is his guilt, and this guilt is the one that society should have for symbolically killing women in this way, denying them the chance of personal fulfillment and independence and equality. Porphyria is ironically the named person in the poem and a social superior to her lover, both forms of status. So Browning shows his patriarchal message by not naming the male and only naming the female. In other words, to point out that she's better than him and should be judged as better, but she can't be because she's female. However, none of this status is enough to overcome the sexism of society. This is why she's punished for her sexual desire. So this is him symbolically saying society does not allow sexual freedom to women. Even more because she's not dependent on a man, because she's not had to marry him, and because she initiates the sexual encounter. So his response to her is an image of slavery. He ties her up with her own hair. So this is an image of treating her as in bondage to him, as a slave to him, as inferior to his power. In other words, he kills her with the symbols of her femininity, her hair, and he does that to show his power over her. In this way, Browning highlights how women are objectified and controlled, so they're turned into objects, and they're controlled by men, so that even their natural desires are forbidden and dangerous, and they get punished for them. So for this feminist perspective to work, you're arguing that the lover represents the sexism of a patriarchal society, okay? Now we're going to look at the Marxist perspective. So you need to know that Karl Marx invented the idea of Marxism, which later became communism. And this is basically looking at class and the social hierarchy and saying that everything that's wrong in society is wrong because of the class system. So the Marxist perspective would see her as a symbol of class. Class and social snobbery have warped her perspective. This has meant that though she loves him, the class system meant she also scorned him. So that's here. So once she's dead, that all it scorned at once is fled. So he's suggesting that she had a real scornful image of him because of his social class. So in a Marxist reading, the upper class superiority is just a veneer, like the soiled gloves and her white skin. They're just the facade, what's on the surface, but not what the real person is. Social oppression by the ruling classes then leads to the lover's madness. Although we can't side with him, we understand that society has driven him to this madness. Had Porphyria been blind to class, the two would have remained happy, and so she would have remained alive. So in the Marxist interpretation, she gets killed because she gives in to this terrible class system. In a Marxist interpretation, Christianity is also a means of oppressing the lower classes. Christianity teaches us to accept the status quo. That means how things are now. Jesus told his disciples to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. In other words, he said to them, don't spend your time rebelling against the Roman occupation, just put up with it because you'll get your reward in heaven. Well, this is a political message, isn't it? It says to Christians, look, put up with society as it is, because that's not really what your life is about. Your life is about behaving in a Christian way and making sure your soul gets to heaven for eternity. So from Marxist points of view, Christianity is a waste of your current life. It puts all your value into the afterlife. Well, that allows society to stay as it is. And therefore, Marxists say, is a way to oppress you. If you're poor, you stay poor because you don't believe it's your right to be rich and find happiness on earth. You simply want to make sure that you don't do anything wrong so that you get happiness in heaven. So the knowledge that justice and reward will come in heaven after death. To a Marxist, this simply allows the rich to hang on to power and wealth and prevents the workers from rising up and overthrowing their oppressors. So you can see that the rise of Marxism in Victorian Britain is linked directly to the decline in Christianity, because really Marxism attacks the Christian viewpoint. Now, when you argue a Marxist perspective, you don't have to say that Browning would agree with it. You can simply say that because he's part of this society, he describes it in a way which shows how power is in the wrong hands, and therefore your Marxist perspective will show how Browning was still part of the class system. However, I prefer the opposite interpretation, that actually Browning was deeply upset about the problems of class, and there are many autobiographical details which back that up, and also the subject matter of his other poems like My Last Duchess. Okay, well, how do we argue the opposite, that actually we could bring a Christian perspective to this poem? Well, yes, a Christian interpretation is a bit more difficult. However, we can see that Porphyria is killed because of her sexual sin. She lusts after someone outside of marriage. Her punishment is therefore just, although being murdered isn't. The lover's challenge to God is not a signal that God doesn't exist, but simply proof of his madness, so proof therefore that he's going to go to hell. Just as we know Porphyria will not be preserved in this frozen tableau by her lover's side, so we know his sense of escaping punishment also won't be preserved. So, from a Christian perspective, the description at the end of her sitting together with him is an illusion. She's not really together with him at all. This is in fact just a dead body, and there's no unity between them because she obviously wouldn't appreciate being killed. And so when he writes, "and all night long we have not stirred," this is just his illusion where he's saying, you know, she could have moved away from me if she wanted to. Well, obviously she couldn't because he's killed her. And therefore, his attack on God just appears as another illusion indicative of his madness. And therefore, the Christian reader expects the response from God to be eternal punishment of his soul. Right, another way to get grade 8 and 9 context is to think about the literary context. So why has the poet chosen this particular literary form, and what does it have to do with other works of literature? So Browning's monologues made him a unique poet in his day. He entered into the psychology of his characters, which we get from the monologues. Because many of his characters are evil, he challenges his readers to imagine what his own thoughts might be, his being Browning's. They're deliberately provocative, and each poem also works as a kind of short narrative, a story. Every story demands us to ask for a moral. That's how stories are made. And so perhaps that's another reason he chooses to write in the voice of so many immoral characters. It's another way to challenge us to work out what the moral is. So I hope you find this section on looking at these interpretations really useful, because one of them is going to work for you and give you the top grade, because you can work out what his point is, what the moral of the story is, based on the perspective that you use. Another way to distance himself from the people he wrote about was to set them in history. He sets them in the past, such as My Last Duchess or Abroad. They also force the reader into the role of a detective. What is the speaker leaving out? Who is he talking or confessing to? You know, is it someone who's going to arrest him? Why is he confessing? Does he want to be caught, or is he boasting that he's going to get away with it? They are psychological portraits, and we are asked to understand their psychology, which is going to bring us neatly to psychoanalytical theory. Okay, you can apply this theory to any text. It's really useful, especially relevant to Macbeth, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So this theory is creating, as you might know, by Sigmund Freud, who's writing in the late 1800s. It claims that the personality consists of 3 different elements. They're called the id, the ego, and the superego. Let's look at what the id is. The id is driven by basic drives and needs like hunger, thirst, and libido, in other words, sexual desire. The id acts in order to avoid pain and to find pleasure, and the id acts on impulse and often pays no attention to the consequences of these actions. Now, it's very easy, isn't it, to look at the description of this lover in the poem and see that he is totally driven by his id. His basic drives and needs are satisfied. Next, we have the superego. So the superego is moral, concerned with getting things right and avoiding what's wrong. Instead of acting on instinct like the id, the superego wants to act in socially acceptable ways. It judges us, and it uses guilt to encourage socially acceptable behaviour, choosing right over wrong. The ego tries to compromise or balance the id and the superego. It tries to find ways to satisfy the id in ways which are socially or morally acceptable. So in this context, it tries to find a way for the lovers to be together, despite the superego of society saying that their being together is not moral. The ego will try to defer short-term pleasure if it can see a long-term benefit for the individual. Okay, let's apply that to the poem. A psychoanalytical interpretation would look at the dangers of the id having too much control. Porphyria's lover is almost entirely controlled by his id. He is in open rebellion with the superego, which he sees as the control provided by the class system. He also realizes that Porphyria is controlled by that superego. She does everything that the class system tells her she has to do, and therefore she keeps her love for him secret. Her ego has satisfied the desires of her id, which are to take this lover. But he realizes this is only temporary and that she will soon reject him because of his social status. And we get that from this line here. But passion sometimes would prevail. So the word sometimes clearly shows us that the lover knows he can't rely on that love lasting. It is temporary. So, however, his id is also afraid of her id. His response to her taking the sexual initiative and making him subservient to her is punished with death. Perhaps his superego is at work here, punishing her for the ultimate transgression of being a woman in a patriarchal society who has both social and sexual power over a man. And so that's not allowed in the patriarchal society, and therefore his superego intervenes and kills her. This causes a rupture in his personality, which he cannot control. So to re-establish control, he kills her. Yeah, so having this woman be dominant over him is something that he just can't accept, and therefore this is his response. His descriptions of Porphyria are diminutive. In other words, they make her small, and so he focuses on her little throat. And this is a way that Browning says this is a symbol of his desire for control. He wants to make himself more powerful than her, even in his language. And that will fit any of the interpretations that we talked about. It can show how, as a male, he cannot see her as superior, nor even as an equal. And you know from the autobiographical details that Browning would definitely have disagreed with that view. Right, well, you've definitely got loads of understanding there. I know that was quite complicated. Are you ready for an extra interpretation of the ending to really secure the top grade? Remember, when you write about the ending, you're always writing about the poet's final ideas, their final interpretation, and that gets you much higher grade. So, that moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. Moment reveals his knowledge that her love for him is temporary. It would only last a moment, and soon she will no longer be his. The repetition of mine, there it is, reveals his desperation to keep her love, but also to keep her as a possession. You can see how that links to the patriarchal interpretation. The alliteration of perfectly pure reveals that he wants her virginity as symbolically both pure and perfect. Well, obviously this is ironic because she's clearly no longer a virgin, she's his lover. The only way she is pure is in his mind, in her worship of him. So he kills her rather than let that moment of worship pass. Interestingly, he's unable to name the act of killing her at the start. It's just a thing to do. But this casual language also reveals his lack of guilt. It isn't that he can't face calling himself a murderer, it's more that he simply doesn't care that he is. The important thing is that he has possessed her, and also that he's challenged society's values and challenged God. Notice that he says he kills her with all her hair. So the word all is unexpected and implies that her hair has disgusted him in the past. Why? Well, she's used it to try to seduce him, but also to cover his head and face. So symbolically, covering his face and head with her hair is a symbol of all the ways she feels superior to him. It's kind of obliterated his identity. So his response is to obliterate her identity. he's able to wind her hair into a string, which is a slow and dominant action. And that suggests that Porphyria actually allows this, and she's welcoming this change in his behaviour. This is also emphasised by how she appears to give him time to wind it around her neck 3 times. You know, if she suspected anything, she'd start to struggle and flee. But no, she allows it to carry on 3 times before she realises she's in danger. So the final line in the way I've organised the stanza therefore comes as a surprise to us, to mimic the surprise that she would have. She's totally not expecting this. And that's also heightened by how short the line is. That's the surprise is heightened. It shocks us and reminds us of the shock Porphyria must have felt herself. His description of her death is signposted, though, as untrustworthy. We do not trust the way he describes it. He repeats, she felt no pain, as though to persuade himself this is true. So no pain felt she, I'm quite sure she felt no pain. That's him reassuring himself, does not sound true. And it makes the rest of his description of her sound untrustworthy. So this makes us doubt that in death she is still smiling, as he claims, and that her eyes still laughed, as he claims. And then finally, it challenges us to look at the final line where God has not said a word. It's easy to see this as pure self-deception. Browning has an overwhelmingly Christian readership, and they would definitely choose the Christian perspective. But another possibility is the secrecy of the affair. Porphyria has indeed kept him secret in a cottage unseen by other people. There will be no evidence to say who she met there. This is perhaps another reason why we never find out the name of Porphyria's lover. He is able to remain anonymous because he's never going to be caught. He'll never be brought to justice. So viewed in this way, Browning has this murderer confess to taunt the reader, because he's saying, I could be somebody you know. You'll never know who the murderer was because I'm going to get away with it. Now this interpretation will play to the Victorian fear of crime, which you may know from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then just like in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it could be done to challenge our Christian beliefs. He confesses without fear of being caught and refuses to feel guilt. This challenges us to ask if God really will punish him, or if, as the lover appeals to believe, God is silent because he's absent. He's just not there. If you've stuck it to this section, you're already definitely capable of getting at least a grade 7 and probably more. I'm now going to give a reading. I don't know how many students will appreciate that, but I will monitor this video to see how many of you are still left. If you could give me any comments as to whether the reading is just unnecessary, you don't need them in these videos, or whether you appreciate having them, please let me know so that I can make the videos more useful. The rain set early in tonight. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. When glided in Porphyria, straight she shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up, and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall, and last she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm about her waist and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me. She, too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free from pride and vainitize dissever, and give herself to me for ever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain, but sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she, I'm quite sure she felt no pain, as a shut bud that holds a bee. I warily oped her lids, again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck, her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still. The smiling rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love, she guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. That's enough words from me. Thank you very much. See you soon on my channel.